Get out. He threw her bag into the dirt and slammed the door. 3 days. She'd been his wife for 3 days, and that's all the time it took for Thomas Garrett to beat her until she stopped screaming and throw her out like something he'd used up. She dragged herself onto the next stagecoach with blood on her dress and nowhere to go. When it stopped in Cedar Ridge, the door swung open and she fell into the street wedding dress, torn, face swollen, barely breathing. And the first man who moved toward her wasn't offering help. If you want to know who saved her and what it cost them both, subscribe to this channel and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach door swung open and Emily Harper fell out of it. Not stepped, not climbed. Fell the way a person falls when they've stopped caring whether the ground catches them or not. She hit the dirt of Cedar Ridge's main street on her hands and knees, and for a moment she just stayed there, palms flat in the dust, breathing, like she was trying to remember how. The wedding dress she was wearing had been white once. Now it was the color of dried mud and old blood, torn at the right shoulder where someone had grabbed it hard enough to rip the seam clean through. Her hair, which had probably been pinned up nice for a ceremony 3 days ago in another town, hung in loose dark tangles across the side of her face. The side she was keeping turned away from the crowd, because people were already gathering. Cedar Ridge was a small town, and a woman falling out of a stagecoach in a ruined wedding dress was not something you saw every Tuesday. The driver didn't get down. He set her single carpet bag on the edge of the running board and let it drop into the dirt next to her. He called down without any particular emotion, "This is your stop, miss," and then clicked his horses forward like she was a sack of flour he'd been asked to offload. Emily stayed on her knees for a moment longer than she probably meant to. Then she pushed herself upright, one hand braced on her knee, moving like someone who had learned recently painfully exactly which parts of her body she needed to protect. She reached down and picked up the carpet bag. She didn't look at the crowd. "Lord have mercy," a woman's voice said nearby, soft, automatic, the way people say things when they see something that shocks them and don't have better words ready. A man on the other side of the street laughed a short, mean sound that said he thought the whole thing was entertainment. Emily turned her face in the direction of the laugh. Just turned it. Didn't say anything. But there was something in her expression, not anger, not quite something that said she'd heard worse recently, and this particular man wasn't going to make the list. She started walking. She didn't know where she was going. She was walking because standing still in the middle of a crowd felt worse, and because somewhere in the back of her mind, the only clear thought she had was find a wall. Get your back against something solid. Don't let anyone get behind you. That was what 3 days of marriage to Thomas Garrett had taught her. She'd answered the ad in a newspaper out of Chicago. Thomas Garrett, rancher, Cedar Ridge, Arizona Territory. Seeking a capable woman of good character for marriage and ranch partnership. Honest correspondence. Christian household fair treatment guaranteed. She had read those words 6 times before she wrote back. Fair treatment. That was the phrase that got her. Not love, not beauty, not companionship, just fair treatment. It had seemed honest. It had seemed like something a real person would actually offer, instead of promising the moon. She'd been wrong about that. She was still walking when she heard the voice behind her. "Hey now. Hey, where do you think you're going?" She didn't stop. She adjusted her grip on the carpet bag and kept moving. "I'm talking to you, sweetheart." The man who stepped in front of her wore a good suit for Cedar Ridge, dark wool silver watch chain boots that had been polished that morning. He was broad through the shoulders and had the kind of face that had been handsome once, and knew it even if the years had gotten a little rough with it. He was smiling in a way that had nothing warm in it. His name, though Emily didn't know it yet, was Victor Hale. He owned the saloon. He owned a good portion of the buildings on this street. And he had a very particular eye for women who arrived in Cedar Ridge with no one to meet them. "You need a place to stay," he said. It wasn't a question. "You need a meal. You need someone to look out for you." He tilted his head slightly, studying her face with a kind of professional assessment that made her skin crawl. "I can help with all of that." "I'm fine," she said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. The inside of her mouth was still swollen from where her lip had split 2 days ago, and talking clearly required a kind of careful deliberateness, but she managed it. "You don't look fine," Victor said, still smiling. "You look like you've had a terrible time, and you're alone in a town you don't know and you need someone in your corner." He took one step closer. "Let me be that person." "I said I'm fine. I heard you." He didn't move back. "I'm not sure you mean it." That was when she felt it, the shift in the air around her, the crowd still watching the man not moving. The realization gathering in her chest like cold water that she had walked out of one trap and straight into another, and there was no one here who was going to... She said she's fine. The voice came from behind Victor and to his left. Low, unhurried, with a flatness to it that wasn't aggressive and wasn't quite calm either. It was the voice of someone who had already decided what was going to happen and wasn't particularly interested in negotiating about it. Victor turned. The man standing on the edge of the crowd was tall, lean in the way that came from actual work rather than deliberate habit. He was dusty from the road hat pulled low, and he wasn't looking at Victor with hostility. Exactly. He was looking at him the way you look at a problem you've already solved in your head. "Daniel," Victor said. His smile went thin. "This isn't your business." "I know it isn't," Daniel said. He took one step forward, unhurried, and looked past Victor at Emily. He met her eyes directly, which was the first time all morning that anyone had actually done that. "Ma'am, you're welcome at my ranch tonight if you need a place to land." There was something deliberate in the way he said it. Not an offer wrapped in obligation. Not help that came with a bill attached to it. He said it plainly, like he was telling her the time, and then he waited. "You're with me tonight," he said quietly, "if you want to be." Emily looked at him. She looked at the out he was offering, the choice of it, the fact that it was framed as a choice at all, and something in her chest cracked just slightly at the edges, because she had not been offered a choice in so long that she'd almost forgotten what one felt like. She looked back at Victor Hale. He was still smiling, but the smile had gone careful now, like he was calculating. "I'll go with him," she said. She didn't talk on the wagon ride out to the ranch. Daniel Brooks didn't push her to. He sat at the reins and let the horse set the pace, and didn't fill the silence with anything which she was grateful for. The silence out here was different from the silence of the past 3 days. That silence had been the kind that preceded something. This one just was. After a while she said, "I don't have money to pay you." "Didn't ask for any," he said. "I don't know how long I'd need to stay." "You don't have to know that yet." She turned that over. "You don't know anything about me." He glanced at her sideways, then back at the road. "I know enough." "That's not..." She stopped. "What do you think you know?" He was quiet for a moment. "I know you fell out of a stagecoach in a wedding dress, and a man was already moving toward you before the dust settled. I know you told him to leave you alone twice before I said anything. I know you didn't flinch when I walked up, which means you'd already made a judgment call about me in about 2 seconds and decided I wasn't the same kind of problem." He shifted the reins slightly. "That's enough." She didn't answer that. "What's your name?" he asked. "Emily Harper." A pause. "It was Garrett, for 3 days." "Emily Harper," he said as if confirming it for himself. They didn't talk again until the ranch came into view. The ranch was not pretty. It was functional. A main house, a barn, a small outbuilding she'd later learn was for storage. Everything looked like it had been built by someone who prioritized staying upright over looking nice, which she found unexpectedly reassuring. Ornate things had been hiding something lately. He showed her the back room, small, clean a cot, with a decent blanket. "The door latches from inside," he said. "There's a bar lock if you want it." She looked at the door. At the bar lock. "You installed that yourself?" "No," he said. It was already there. A beat of quiet. It came with the room. She understood then, without either of them saying it out loud, that she was probably not the first person who'd needed a room that locked from the inside. The thought was both comforting and sad in equal measure. "I'll earn my keep," she said. "I cook, I clean, I work." "I'm not running a labor exchange," he said. "I know, but I need to." She looked at him directly. "If I sit still, I think too much. So let me work." He held her gaze for a moment, and then nodded once. "Breakfast is at 5:30, he said. "I'm usually in the barn by 6, so 8. That first morning, she was already in the kitchen when he came in from the barn at 6:15. He stopped in the doorway. She had found his coffee tin, his cast-iron skillet, his dried salt pork, and the eggs from what she'd discovered was a 4-hen setup behind the barn. There was coffee on the stove and 2 plates on the table. "I assumed you ate breakfast," she said without turning from the stove. He sat down at the table. He looked at the plate in front of him like he wasn't quite sure what to do with it. She set a fork beside it without comment and poured the coffee. He said, "My wife used to cook eggs this way." She went very still for just a moment. Then she set the coffee pot down carefully. "I can do them different." "No," he said, quieter now. "Don't." She sat down across from him, and they ate, and the silence was different again, fuller somehow, like it had weight to it. Not the comfortable weight of people who knew each other. The careful weight of people who were beginning to suspect they might. Victor Hale came to the ranch on the 3rd day. She saw him from the kitchen window before he reached the house, and her hands went still in the dishwater. He was riding easy, unhurried, which was somehow worse than if he'd been riding hard. Unhurried meant he wasn't worried. Unhurried meant he thought he had time. Daniel came out of the barn before Victor reached the house. She watched them talk from the window, couldn't hear the words, but she could read the posture of it. Victor animated expansive gesturing with one hand. Daniel still arms at his sides, not moving toward him and not moving away. After a few minutes, Victor left. When Daniel came inside, she was still standing at the window. "What did he want?" she asked. Daniel poured himself water from the pitcher on the counter. "Told me you were going to be trouble in this town," he said. "And you said—" He set the cup down. "I said he could mind his own ranch, seeing as he doesn't have one." She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Then she said, "He's not going to stop." "No," Daniel agreed. "He's not that kind of man." "What kind of man is he?" Daniel leaned back against the counter and looked at her steadily. "The kind who doesn't understand that no is a complete sentence." She felt something shift in her chest, not quite relief, because relief was still too big a word for what she was allowing herself, but something adjacent to it, something that said, "This person understands the thing you're trying to say." "You have a past with him," she said. It wasn't really a question. Daniel's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "He had a past with my wife," he said. And then he straightened up from the counter and walked back out to the barn and left that sentence sitting in the kitchen between them, like something she'd have to learn to step around. She heard about Anna Brooks from the preacher's wife. It happened 10 days in when Emily walked into town for supplies. She was recognizing faces by then, the general store owner, the deputy, the woman who ran the dress shop. Cedar Ridge was learning her in return, but cautiously the way small towns learn new arrivals. With their eyes before their mouths. But the preacher's wife, a soft round woman named Edna Price, who smelled like lavender and had a habit of touching your arm when she talked to you, stopped her outside the mercantile and said with the tone of someone doing her a favor, "You know about his wife, I assume." "He mentioned he's a widower," Emily said carefully. "Widower." Edna made a small sound. "That's one way to put it." She glanced left and right with the practiced efficiency of a person who'd spent years checking that they had an audience before delivering information. Anna Brooks died by her own hand. 3 years ago, April. Emily felt the street shift slightly under her feet. "I didn't know the details," she said. "Most people don't talk about it directly," Edna said. "Out of respect for Daniel. He's a good man, he is. Hard-working, decent, keeps to himself." Another glance. But there are those who say he could have done more, before it got to where it got to, that there were signs he didn't act on. Emily looked at the woman carefully. What kind of signs? Well, Edna's voice dropped conspiratorially. Anna wasn't herself the last several months. Anyone could see it. She'd stopped coming to church, stopped visiting. Daniel was away a lot that year, long cattle drives business in Tucson. And when she stopped, pressed her lips together. When it happened, people said he seemed more guilty than grief-stricken, which is its own kind of thing, isn't it? Emily thanked her and went into the mercantile and moved through her list of supplies on pure automatic because her mind had gone somewhere else entirely. Not because of what Edna Price had told her. She'd known grief that looked like guilt, and guilt that looked like grief, and the way people on the outside of someone's pain always had their own interpretation ready. She was thinking about the room with the bar lock on the inside. She was thinking about Anna. She was thinking about what it meant that Daniel had told her he was a widower, but not how his wife had died, and whether that was secrecy or just pain that hadn't found its shape yet. She asked him that night. They were on the porch after supper, him in the chair, her on the step, watching the sky do what it did out here, which was turn colors you didn't have names for. She'd been working up to it for an hour. Your wife, she said. How did she die? He didn't move. He held his coffee cup on his knee and looked at the horizon, and after a long moment he said, She took her own life. I'm sorry, Emily said. And she meant it the way you mean things when the words are inadequate, but they're all you have. I was in Tucson, he said. 3-day trip turned into 5 because of weather. When I came back, she was... He stopped. I should have come back sooner. You couldn't know. No, he said. But I should have known something was wrong before I left. His voice was very flat when he said this. The flatness of something that had been said internally so many times, it had worn smooth. She wasn't herself for months. I told myself she'd come back around. I told myself I just needed to get through the season, and then I'd have more time, and things would even out. He paused. I was wrong about that. Emily was quiet for a moment. What happened to her? She asked carefully. Before she died. Something happened to her. He looked at her sideways. Sharp, quick. What do you mean? I mean, something happened to her that wasn't about you being away too much. Something happened that broke her. The silence that followed was very long. The sky finished turning colors and settled into dark. There was a man, he said finally, a powerful man in the county. Richard Caldwell. He said the name the way you say something that tastes bad. He assaulted her while I was away on a drive. She didn't tell me for 2 weeks. When she finally told me, I went to the marshal. A pause that had real weight in it. Caldwell had friends in the right places. Nothing happened, no charges, not even a conversation on record. He went on with his life like he hadn't done anything. Emily had gone very still on the step. She couldn't get past it, Daniel said. And I couldn't make the world make it right. I tried to tell her it wasn't her fault. I tried to tell her we'd find another way. I tried... He stopped again. The word tried hanging between them like an accusation he was making against himself. It wasn't enough. Daniel, she said quietly. Don't, he said, not unkindly. I've heard it was not your fault enough times that the words don't mean anything anymore. I know what people mean when they say it. I also know what I know. She didn't say it was not your fault. She sat with him in the dark, and after a while she said, Did Caldwell ever face anything? Any consequence at all? Daniel's jaw moved. He died, he said. About a year after Anna. They said it was an accident. Fell from his horse on a night ride. Broke his neck. Another pause. Marshall investigated briefly. Ruled it accidental. Do you believe that? Emily asked. He looked at her. A long look in the dark, with the quiet of the ranch all around them. I've learned, he said slowly, that sometimes things that look like accidents are justice wearing a disguise. She held his gaze. She didn't look away. And something passed between them in that moment, not understanding exactly not yet, but the beginning of it, the edge of something that was going to take time to name. The letter arrived 2 weeks later. She found it slipped under the kitchen door in the early morning. No envelope, just a single piece of paper folded, once her name written on the outside, in a handwriting she didn't recognize. She unfolded it, read it again. Miss Harper, your husband Thomas Garrett is dead. He was found 4 days ago. The county sheriff in Maricopa is asking about you. You should know that Victor Hale has told them you were the last person with Garrett before you arrived in Cedar Ridge. I thought you should know before they come looking. A friend. She stood in the kitchen in the early morning quiet and read that letter 3 times, and then she sat down at the table and put her face in her hands. Thomas Garrett was dead. The man who had beaten her for 3 days and thrown her out of his house was dead, and someone in this town had decided she needed to know that the sheriff was asking about her and Victor Hale. Victor Hale, who had never spoken to her before that first afternoon, had given her name to law enforcement. She heard Daniel's boots on the porch. She didn't have time to put the letter away before he came through the door. He looked at her face and stopped walking immediately. What happened? She slid the letter across the table without speaking. He read it standing up. She watched his face move through things, a tightening around the eyes, a settling of his jaw. When he set it back down on the table, he was very quiet for a moment. You didn't kill him, he said. Not a question. She looked at him. He was alive when I got on that stagecoach. He was alive and drunk and angry, and he threw my bag out the door behind me and told me I wasn't worth the trouble of keeping. She paused. That's the last I saw of him. I believe you, Daniel said. She blinked. She hadn't realized until he said it how much she had been bracing herself for doubt. Victor Hale told them your name, she said. Why would he do that? He doesn't know me. Daniel's expression shifted into something harder and quieter. He knows you're here, he said, and he knows that makes him look like the alternative if things here stop working out. She stared at him. He's trying to run me out of town, she said slowly, by making me a suspect in my husband's death. He's trying to make you afraid enough to need him, Daniel said. Victor Hale doesn't run people out of places. He makes them desperate enough to run to him instead. He picked up the letter, folded it, set it back down. The sheriff will probably come in the next few days. You're going to need to talk to him. What do I say? The truth, Daniel said. All of it. What Garrett did to you. What condition you were in when you arrived. Every person who saw you step off that stagecoach. He met her eyes. You have nothing to hide. And if they decide what Hale told them is more convincing than the truth. He looked at her for a long, steady moment. Then we figure out what comes next, together. The word landed between them plainly with no ceremony. Together. She looked down at the folded letter. She thought about Thomas Garrett somewhere in Maricopa, dead in a way that had nothing to do with her. She thought about Victor Hale in his good suit and his polished boots, feeding her name to a sheriff like she was leverage he could spend. She thought about the room with the bar lock. She thought about what it meant to be in a place where the word together was offered without strings. And she made a decision sitting at that kitchen table in the early morning of a ranch in Cedar Ridge, Arizona territory in the year 1882. The same decision she'd been slowly, quietly making for 2 weeks without quite letting herself admit it. She was going to stay. Not because she had nowhere else to go. Not because she was afraid of what waited outside. But because this place, this worn, functional, unbeautiful ranch with its bar lock and its silent breakfasts, and the man who offered choices instead of orders, was the first place in a long time that had felt like it might be worth fighting for. All right, she said quietly. Daniel nodded once. Neither of them said anything else. He poured the coffee. She started the eggs. And outside, Cedar Ridge went on not knowing that what was building inside that ranch was something it was going to have to reckon with before long. The sheriff came on a Thursday. Emily heard the horse before she saw him. A single rider coming up the road at an easy trot. unhurried, the kind of pace that said official business rather than emergency. She was in the kitchen. She didn't move to the window. She stood where she was and finished drying the dish in her hands and set it on the shelf, and then she smoothed her apron and walked to the door and opened it before he could knock. He was younger than she'd expected. Mid-30s, square-jawed, with a deputy's badge that caught the morning light and a hat he took off when she opened the door, which she noted. Men who took their hats off at doors were either well-raised or performing courtesy. She hadn't decided which category he fell into yet. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm looking for Emily Harper, formerly Garrett." "You found her," she said. He glanced past her into the house, then back at her face. She watched him take in the fading bruise along her jaw, the slight discoloration still visible under her left eye, and something in his expression shifted. Not sympathy exactly. More like recalibration. "Deputy Cal Reardon, Maricopa County," he said. "I have some questions about Thomas Garrett." "Come in," she said. "I'll put on coffee." Daniel came through the back door 2 minutes later, still carrying his work gloves. He didn't say anything, just pulled out a chair and sat at the far end of the table, present but not inserting himself. The deputy looked at him, then at Emily. "He stays," she said without turning from the stove. Reardon sat down. He put his hat on the table and took out a small notebook and looked at her steadily. "Thomas Garrett was found dead in his home outside Maricopa 9 days ago," he said. "Cause of death is being treated as undetermined pending further inquiry. His neighbor reported that a woman, a new wife, had been seen at the property in the days preceding his death and was not there when the body was discovered." "That woman was me," Emily said. She set the coffee down and sat across from him. "I was there for 3 days. He beat me for most of them. When he was done with me, he told me to leave, and I left." She kept her voice level. "I did not harm Thomas Garrett. Can you tell me your movements after leaving the property?" "I walked to the road and waited for the eastbound stage. I rode it to Cedar Ridge. I arrived 6 days ago. Every person in this town who was on Main Street that afternoon saw me get off that coach." Reardon wrote something. "You were wearing your wedding dress when you arrived here. I was wearing it when I left his house because it was what I had on. I didn't have time to pack thoughtfully. He threw my bag out the door." The deputy looked up from his notebook. "Miss Harper, did anyone else have cause to harm Thomas Garrett? Anyone you're aware of?" "I was married to him for 3 days," she said. "I didn't know much about his life." "Was he a drinking man?" "Every hour I knew him." Another note. "And you have no information about who might have been responsible for his death?" "None," she said. Reardon looked at her for a long moment, the steady, patient look of someone trained to wait out silences. Then he looked at Daniel. "Mr. Brooks, you can confirm when Miss Harper arrived here and her conduct since—" "She arrived 6 days ago," Daniel said. "She's been here every day since. She hasn't left the property except once to go into town for supplies in full view of half the street." "And you'd be willing to state that formally if it comes to that?" "Already planning on it," Daniel said. Reardon closed his notebook and picked up his coffee. He drank from it and set it back down, and the silence stretched out for a moment into something almost conversational. Then he said quietly, "The man who gave us your name, Miss Harper. Victor Hale. You know him?" "I met him once," she said. "For about 2 minutes. He tried to make me an offer I didn't want." "What kind of offer?" "The kind men make to women who arrive in towns alone and look like they have no options." She held the deputy's gaze. "He didn't take my refusal particularly well." Reardon turned his hat in his hands, once a slow rotation thinking. "I've had dealings with Victor Hale before," he said in a tone that wasn't exactly official and wasn't exactly gossip. It was the tone of a man leaving information on a table for someone else to pick up. "I appreciate you telling me that," Emily said. He stood, nodded to them both, and left. After the sound of his horse faded, the kitchen was very quiet. "Well?" Emily said. "He doesn't think you did it," Daniel said. "No," she agreed. "But Victor Hale wanted him here, and he wanted me to know he could put a sheriff at my door." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "He's making a point." "Let him make it," Daniel said. He stood and picked up his gloves from the table. Points don't mean anything when the person they're aimed at stops being afraid of them. She looked at him, this quiet, steady man, who said things plainly, and meant them, who sat in on a sheriff's interview just by being present, who offered choices when the rest of the world was handing her ultimatums. She thought, I am not afraid. And then, more honestly, not yet, but I am learning how not to be. There was a woman named Clara Fitch who came to call on the second week. She arrived on foot, which meant she'd walked the 2 miles from town, which meant she'd wanted to come badly enough to do it in the midday heat. She was perhaps 60, with silver hair and capable hands, and the direct, unhurried manner of someone who had decided a long time ago not to spend energy on things that didn't matter. She brought a covered dish. She set it on the kitchen table and looked at Emily and said, "I knew Anna Brooks. I wanted to meet the woman Daniel brought home." Emily looked at her steadily. "He didn't bring me home," she said. "He offered me a place to land, and I took it." Clara Fitch studied her for a moment and then smiled, small and genuine. "Good," she said. "Sit down. Tell me about yourself." She did not ask about the bruises. She did not look at Emily with pity or with the particular kind of horrified curiosity people wore when they wanted the story, but didn't want to seem like they wanted it. She just sat across the table and listened, and Emily found herself talking not about Thomas Garrett, not about the stagecoach, but about Chicago, about the newspaper ad, about what it had felt like to read the words fair treatment and think they were a promise. "The West is full of promises," Clara said. "So is the East," Emily said. Clara laughed, real and sudden. "That's true," she paused. "How is Daniel?" "Quiet," Emily said carefully. "He's always quiet. But there's a difference between quiet because you're at peace and quiet because you're underwater." Clara turned her coffee cup in her hands. "He was underwater for a long time after Anna." "I know what happened to her," Emily said. Clara looked at her without surprise. "Then you know some of it, not all." Emily went still. "What don't I know?" "Anna didn't just lose hope," Clara said quietly. "She lost trust. There's a difference. Hope is something you can sometimes rebuild. Trust when it's broken in a particular way by a particular kind of man." She stopped. "She told me what Caldwell did to her. She told me before she told Daniel. She made me promise not to tell anyone else." "I understand why she made you promise that," Emily said. "I know you do." Clara looked at her steadily. "I think that's why I walked out here today." They sat with that for a moment, the shared understanding of women who had learned certain things about certain men and about the promises they were asked to keep and the weight of them. "Daniel blames himself," Emily said. "Emily, Daniel will always blame himself," Clara said. "That's the shape of his grief. You can't take it from him. You can only—" She paused, choosing carefully. "You can only be someone who doesn't require him to pretend it's gone." Emily thought about that for a long time after Clara Fitch left. 3 weeks in, she found the photograph. She hadn't been looking for anything. She was actually cleaning the deep kind that required moving furniture, and she pulled a wooden box from under the bed in Daniel's room to sweep behind it and then set it back without opening it, because it was not her box and not her business. But a corner of it caught on the edge of a floorboard and knocked sideways, and the lid came loose, and a photograph slid out onto the floor face up. She stood there for a moment, broom in hand, looking at it. Anna Brooks had been beautiful. Dark hair, dark eyes, a direct way of looking at a camera that made you feel like the camera had been assessed and found acceptable. She was standing in front of this house, the same house, years younger, the porch posts not yet weathered to the gray they were now. She was smiling. Next to her was Daniel, and he looked like a different person. Not younger, or not only younger. He looked like a man who had not yet learned to brace himself. There was nothing guarded in his face. He was looking at his wife with the kind of uncomplicated happiness that you only ever have before the thing that teaches you it's not safe. Emily carefully put the photograph back in the box. She closed the lid and set the box back under the bed exactly as she'd found it. She stood up and finished sweeping, and she did not say anything to Daniel about it. But she thought about that photograph for days. About the face of a man who had not yet learned to protect himself. About what it cost to look like that once, and then have to learn not to. Victor Hale came back 4 days after that. Not to the ranch this time, he was smarter than that. He was at the general store when she went in for supplies, as if by coincidence positioned near the door in his good suit, and she would have had to turn around and leave to avoid him. She didn't turn around. She walked past him to the counter and gave her list to the store owner, a man named Herb Paulson, who had the energy of someone perpetually aware that drama was about to happen in his vicinity. "Emily," Victor said from behind her. Easy familiar, like they were old friends. "You're looking better." She didn't turn. "Mr. Paulson, I'll need a pound of coffee and whatever you have for dried beans." "The sheriff came and went," Victor said. "No charges. That must be a relief." Paulson was writing down her order with great concentration on his paper. "You look like you've settled in nicely out at Brooks's place," Victor continued. "Though I wonder how long that particular arrangement suits you." She turned then, slowly. She looked at him with the full weight of her attention, and what she'd discovered over the past few weeks was that she had a quality she'd always had it. It had just been beaten down into a place she couldn't reach for a while, of making her gaze count. "Mr. Hale," she said, "you gave my name to a county deputy and told him I might be involved in my husband's death. You did that inside a week of meeting me for reasons that have nothing to do with Thomas Garrett, and everything to do with the fact that I didn't accept your offer on the street that first day." She kept her voice conversational, pleasant almost. "I want you to understand something. That deputy looked at my face and made his own judgment about what happened to me and who might be responsible for it. And I believe you know that. Which means you made that move knowing it wasn't going to work and did it anyway, just to let me know you could." Victor's smile hadn't moved, but something behind it had shifted. "I'm telling you," she said, "that I noticed. And I want you to know I'm not the kind of woman who doesn't notice things." A beat of silence in the store. Herb Paulson had stopped writing entirely. "I like you," Victor said. And the unnerving thing was that he meant it not in any good way, but genuinely. Like her resistance to him was a feature he found interesting. "I really do. I don't need you to," she said. She turned back to the counter. "Mr. Paulson, the beans." She told Daniel about it that evening. He listened without interrupting, standing at the kitchen counter, and when she finished he said, "You shouldn't have engaged with him directly." "Probably not," she agreed. "He'll take it as an invitation." "I know." She looked at Daniel. "But it felt necessary. I needed to say it out loud where someone could hear it." He looked at her for a moment. "Did it help?" She thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said. Stupidly, but yes. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. "At least you know it was stupid." "I know most things are stupid right before I do them," she said. "It doesn't always stop me." This time, it was a real smile, brief, unexpected, and gone almost before she could register it. But she registered it. She filed it away with the same care she'd put that photograph back in its box. They ate dinner. The silence was the comfortable kind now, the kind that didn't need filling. After a while, Daniel said, "Victor Hale had money dealings with Richard Caldwell." She looked up. "Years back," he said, "before everything with Anna. They had some kind of land arrangement. I never knew the details, and I didn't pursue them, because after what Caldwell did, I couldn't think about anything connected to him without—" He stopped. "Anyway, I've been thinking about it since you told me he gave your name to Reardon." "You think Hale knew about what Caldwell did to Anna?" she said. "I think it's possible he knew and didn't care," Daniel said. "Or worse, knew and protected him, because Caldwell was useful." Emily was quiet for a moment. "That would mean Victor Hale is not just a predatory man with bad manners," she said slowly. "That would mean he's something more deliberately dangerous." "Yes?" Daniel said. The word settled over the table like a change in weather. Then we need to understand what he wants from me specifically, she said. He can't want me badly enough to go to this much trouble out of pure stubbornness. There's something else. I've been thinking that too, Daniel said. And he looked at her directly. I think someone told him about you before you arrived. I think he knew you were coming to Cedar Ridge before that stagecoach door opened. She stared at him. Thomas Garrett, she said slowly. Garrett was connected to men in this region. You said so. Caldwell's network didn't die with Caldwell, Daniel said. Men like that have roots in a dozen directions. I just don't know yet which roots are still alive and which ones Hale is tending. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling and thought about Thomas Garrett drunk and violent in a house outside Maricopa and the newspaper ad she'd answered, and the particular cruelty of discovering that the trap had been set before she'd even seen the bait. I need to know more about what Garrett was involved in, she said. So do I, Daniel said. The question is, who to ask without letting Victor know we're asking? Clara Fitch, Emily said immediately. She knows this town. She knew Anna. She paused. She's the kind of woman who pays attention and remembers. Daniel looked at her. There was something in his expression she hadn't seen before, not surprise exactly, but a kind of recognition. Like she'd said something he'd been thinking but hadn't found the shape for. All right, he said. I'll ride to town tomorrow. I'll come with you, she said. A pause. You don't have to. I know, she said. That's why I want to. He held her gaze for a moment, and then nodded once. And then they cleared the table, and the evening went on. And Cedar Ridge sat out there in the dark, doing what towns do, breathing and turning and keeping its secrets under its tongue, not knowing that two people in a ranch 2 miles out had just decided to start pulling threads. Clara Fitch opened her door the next morning and looked at the two of them standing on her step and said without any preamble at all, "It's about Victor Hale." "Partly," Daniel said. "Come in." She sat them at her kitchen table. She was a woman of kitchen tables, Clara Fitch, which Emily appreciated, and poured coffee she already had made, and then folded her hands and looked at them and said, "Ask me what you need to ask." "Caldwell and Hale," Daniel said. "What do you know?" Clara looked at her coffee for a moment. "I know they were partners in a land scheme," she said, "about 5 years back. They bought up 3 parcels north of town under separate names and then combined them and sold to a railroad surveyor who turned out not to represent the railroad at all. Money changed hands. Nobody could prove anything. 2 small families lost their claims and got almost nothing for it." She paused. One of those families was a widow with 2 boys. She ended up leaving the territory. Emily felt something cold move through her. Victor Hale drove a widow off her land. With Caldwell's help and a county recorder who owed Caldwell a favor, Clara said. "Yes." "And Garrett," Emily said. "Thomas Garrett. Did he have connections to either of them?" Clara looked at her. A careful look. "Where did you hear that name?" "He was my husband," Emily said. For 3 days. Clara's expression shifted through several things rapidly. Shock, then understanding, then a kind of grim recognition. "Emily," she said slowly. "Did you know why Garrett had that newspaper ad running?" "He wanted a wife," Emily said. "That's what the ad said." "He wanted a wife with a deed," Clara said. "There was a land grant, old one pre-territorial, worth a significant amount now that the railroad is moving through this section of the territory. It was in your name." The kitchen went completely silent. "In my name," Emily said. Very carefully. "It came through your mother's family, I believe. Garrett found out about it before he placed the ad. He was working with someone I don't know who told him you had it and that marriage would give him legal access to it." Clara looked at her steadily. "Emily, do you have papers in that carpet bag of yours that you haven't looked at carefully?" Emily thought about the carpet bag. The one she'd carried off the stagecoach. The one she'd shoved under her cot and barely touched because she couldn't bring herself to go through the few things she'd brought from her old life. "I might," she said. Her voice was very even. "Then I think you should look at them tonight," Clara said. "Because if Garrett is dead, and the deed is still in your name, and Victor Hale knows it exists." She stopped. Let the sentence finish itself in the air between them. Emily looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at Emily. The thing that had been building between them, the careful, unspoken architecture of something neither of them had named, shifted in that moment into something sharper and more urgent. Because this was no longer just a woman healing from a violent marriage in a rancher's spare room. This was something with documents and money, and a dead man, and a dangerous one, and the ground under all of it had just become very much less stable. "We go back to the ranch," Daniel said quietly. "Right now." Emily was already standing. The carpet bag was where she'd left it under the cot in the back room. She pulled it out and opened it on the bed and went through it piece by piece. 2 dresses, her mother's Bible, a small tin of hairpins, a handful of letters she'd been sent from Garrett before she'd agreed to come, and then, at the very bottom, tucked into the lining, in a way that suggested it had been placed there carefully and deliberately, a folded document she didn't remember putting there. She unfolded it. She read it twice. Then she walked into the main room where Daniel was waiting and put it on the table in front of him. He read it. His jaw tightened. 40 acres, he said, north of town. North of town, she confirmed. That's the railroad corridor, he said. That land will be worth... He stopped. More than enough for someone to kill for, she said, quietly, with certainty, with... She stood at the table in the ranch house in Cedar Ridge, holding a land deed she hadn't known she owned with a dead husband she hadn't killed and a dangerous man in town who had known about this document before she had. And she understood now with the terrible clarity of someone seeing a pattern from the inside that she had never been rescued off that street. She had been collected. The only question was by whom. She looked at Daniel. His face was very still. He was reading the deed a second time with the focused expression of a man working through the implications of something, and she watched him reach the same conclusion she had. She could see it arrive in his eyes, the particular shadow of it. He looked up. "I didn't know," he said. And the thing was, she could hear it. The genuine, unguarded quality of those 3 words, the absence of any performance in them. "I know you didn't," she said. "Emily?" "I know," she said again. Firmer. "Daniel, I know." He held her gaze for a long moment, and she let him. She let the moment sit there without retreating from it, because she had learned slowly in this ranch, in this back room with its bar lock, that sometimes the bravest thing was simply to stay in the room when the hard thing was being said. "We find out who else knew about this deed," she said, "and then we figure out what we're going to do about it." Daniel set the document down on the table between them. "Together," he said. She didn't flinch at the word this time. "Together," she said. Clara Fitch came to the ranch the next morning without being asked. She arrived before breakfast, which told Emily everything about how seriously the woman was taking this. Clara Fitch did not skip her morning routine for small things. She knocked once, came through the door Emily opened, set a wrapped parcel of cornbread on the counter, and sat down at the table like she'd been invited. "I remembered something last night," she said. "After you left. I couldn't sleep until I decided to come tell you in person." Daniel poured her coffee. He sat across from her. Emily stayed standing, arms crossed, because something in Clara's face made her not want to sit yet. "The land deed," Clara said. "The one in Emily's name. I've been trying to remember where I first heard about it. It came to me at 2 a.m. She looked at Emily directly. "Victor Hale mentioned it, at a town meeting, about 8 months ago before you arrived. He was talking about the railroad corridor and who held claims in that section. He mentioned a name, Harper. Said the claim was dormant and might be contestable if the heir couldn't be located." The kitchen went very quiet. "He was already planning to contest it," Emily said. "I believe he was building a case to have it declared abandoned," Clara said. which would have made it available for purchase at county auction, at which point a man with Victor Hale's resources and friends in the county recorder's office would have had very little competition. But then Garrett found out about it first, Daniel said. And Garrett decided marriage was a faster and cleaner mechanism than a county auction, Emily said. The words came out flat and cold, and she let them. He placed the ad. I answered it. He had 3 days to get me to sign something before I understood what was happening. She paused. Is that why he started beating me so quickly? Because I didn't sign fast enough? Clara looked at her with the steady, unflinching gaze of a woman who had lived long enough to hear hard things without collapsing under them. I think it's likely, she said quietly. I'm sorry. Emily uncrossed her arms. She pulled out a chair and sat down. She needed a moment to let that settle, the particular ugliness of it, the way it reframed those 3 days from senseless violence into calculated violence, which was somehow worse. Senseless cruelty was a kind of madness. Calculated cruelty was a choice. So Garrett failed, she said after a moment. He died before he got the signature. And now Victor Hale knows the deed is still in my name, because someone in Garrett's network told him. And Hale can't contest it at auction anymore because I'm alive and present and holding the document. Which makes you either an obstacle or an opportunity, Daniel said. He thinks I'm an opportunity, Emily said. That's what his offer was about on the street that first day. He didn't know me from anyone. But he knew about the deed, and he knew a woman arriving alone in a wedding dress with bruises on her face was someone who might be desperate enough to accept help from the wrong direction. He thought he could charm you into signing it over, Clara said. Or marry me himself, Emily said, which would accomplish the same thing legally. The three of them sat with that for a moment. Outside, a wind had come up and was moving through the eaves of the house in a low, continuous sound. We need a lawyer, Daniel said. We need more than that, Emily said. We need to understand the full shape of what Hale has built. The land scheme with Caldwell, the county recorder, the connection to Garrett. If this is a pattern, and it looks like a pattern, then there are other people who've been hurt by it. Other claims. Other women or families who didn't know what was being taken from them. Clara looked at her with something that was close to pride. You think like someone who's been wronged before and decided not to let it happen again. I think like someone who's finished being surprised by men who make plans, Emily said. It was Daniel who went looking for the lawyer, and it was the going that first cracked something open between them that couldn't be closed again. He told her he was riding to Tucson to find a territorial attorney, a man named Whitfield he'd dealt with once on a grazing dispute. He told her it would be 2 days, maybe 3. He told her Clara had agreed to come stay at the ranch while he was gone. He told her all of this at the kitchen table, the evening before he left, in the methodical, practical way he told her most things. And then he stood up to clear his plate, and she said without planning to Daniel. He stopped. Be careful, she said. He turned. He looked at her, not a long look, but a full one, the kind that took the whole of what was in front of him, and something moved through his face that he didn't quite manage to keep out of it. Something that wasn't grief for once. Something with a different quality entirely. I will, he said. He left at dawn. She stood on the porch and watched him ride out, and didn't go back inside until the sound of his horse had gone completely. And even then she stood in the kitchen for a minute just holding her own hands, not thinking about anything in particular. Just aware of how quiet the ranch was when he wasn't in it. Clara arrived by mid-morning. She came with a basket of sewing, and the determined energy of a woman who considered idle worry a personal failing. She sat in the chair by the window and sewed and talked, and Emily was grateful for both. Tell me about when they were happy, Emily said sometime in the afternoon. Clara looked up. She didn't ask who. They were happy for a long time, she said. 6-7 years. Daniel was different then, not lighter exactly. He was always serious, but there was less weight on him. Anna laughed enough for both of them. She had a way of finding the absurd thing in any situation and pointing at it until everyone else saw it too. She smiled private and fond. She used to say that Daniel kept her grounded, and she kept him from turning into furniture. Emily laughed short and genuine. He loved her completely, Clara said. which is why what happened afterward almost killed him too, just more slowly. She paused her needle. Grief, like that guilt grief, where you can't separate what you lost from what you believe you failed to prevent, it doesn't go away. It just changes shape, becomes part of the structure of you. I know something about that, Emily said. I thought you might. They sewed and talked, and the afternoon moved, and Emily kept one part of her attention on the road without letting herself examine why. He was back in 2.5 days. She heard the horse and was in the doorway before he reached the porch, which she recognized was a thing she was going to have to think about later. He swung down and tied the horse and came up the steps and stopped when he saw her face. "Whitfield is coming," he said. "He'll be here in 4 days." He looked at what I described and he said, He stopped. He said, "It's bigger than I thought." "How much bigger?" He came inside. Clara was in the kitchen. He sat at the table and pulled off his hat and put it on the surface in front of him and said, "The deed isn't just 40 acres. There are additional claims attached to it, pre-territorial grants from your mother's family going back 20 years. Whitfield pulled the original filings. The combined parcel is closer to 200 acres, Emily, right through the center of where the railroad is planning to run its next branch line." Emily sat down. She did it carefully, the way you sit when the floor might be less solid than it looks. 200 acres, she said. "Worth enough that men have apparently been maneuvering around it for years," Daniel said. "Whitfield says there have been 3 separate attempts to have the Harper claims declared dormant or abandoned through the county recorder's office. All 3 were blocked because the filings were technically imperfect. Someone, maybe a clerk, maybe someone your mother paid years ago, kept rejecting the paperwork on procedural grounds." "Someone was protecting it," Clara said from the kitchen doorway. "Without Emily knowing," Daniel said. Emily pressed her hands flat on the table. "Garrett knew the full size of it," she said. "That's why he was in such a hurry, 3 days. He needed me to sign before I could find out what I actually owned." "And when you didn't sign," Daniel said, "he decided to try force instead of persuasion." "And when that didn't work either," Emily said quietly, "he threw me out." She thought about that. About Thomas Garrett, drunk and violent, making the calculation that she was more trouble than she was worth and cutting his losses. About the fact that his impatience had accidentally saved her. "He's dead," she said. "And I'm alive and I have the deed, which means whatever Hale planned next, he has to go through me." "Whitfield will file a formal claim assertion when he arrives," Daniel said. "That puts it on official record that you're present alive and contesting any attempt to reclassify the land. It won't resolve everything, but it changes the legal landscape significantly." "And Hale," she said. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Hale will know about the filing within a day of it happening. He has people in the county office." "Good," Emily said. Both of them looked at her. "I want him to know," she explained. "I want him to understand that I know what he knows, and I'm not hiding from it." Clara made a sound that might have been approval. "Emily," Daniel said carefully, "when Hale realizes the passive approach isn't working, he's going to try something more direct." "I know that," she said. "You should understand what that might mean." "I understand it." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not Thomas Garrett's wife anymore, Daniel. I'm not a woman who arrived in a town 3 weeks ago with nothing. I have the deed, I have a lawyer coming, I have Clara, and I have you." She paused. "I'm not afraid of Victor Hale." He held her gaze for a long time. "All right," he said finally. "Not agreement exactly. Something closer to trust." Whitfield arrived on schedule, a compact, dry-voiced man in his 50s who carried a leather satchel, like it was an extension of his arm, and had the precise, unhurried manner of someone who had spent 30 years untangling other people's disasters. He sat at the kitchen table and opened the satchel and spread papers across the surface and began explaining things with the efficient clarity of a man who didn't believe in softening facts. The combined Harper land claim was legitimate, clear, and substantial. The 3 previous attempts to have it declared abandoned had failed on procedural grounds, which Whitfield now believed had been deliberate. Someone had filed those objections, knowing they would be rejected simply to create a paper trail that could later be used to argue the claim had been actively contested. It was a patience game. Wear down the record until a sympathetic judge might rule the land effectively disputed and put it up for resolution. "Who filed the objections?" Emily asked. Whitfield looked at her over his papers. "The first two were filed under a land-holding company called Ridgeline Partners," he said. "The third was filed by an individual, a man named Carlton Briggs, who when I traced him turns out to be a business partner of one Victor Hale." The name landed on the table like something solid. "Can you prove a direct connection?" Daniel asked. "Between Hale and the filing strategy, not yet," Whitfield said, "but the pattern is clear enough that any territorial judge worth his seat would see it." He folded his hands. "Miss Harper, I want to file a formal assertion of claim tomorrow morning at the county office. I want your signature on it tonight. Once it's filed, the land is legally defended, and any further attempt to reclassify or contest it becomes a matter of formal litigation, which is a much longer and more expensive road for your opponents." "File it," Emily said. "There's a risk," Whitfield said. "The people who want this land may accelerate their efforts once they see the filing." "I know," she said. "You understand what that might look like." "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "I was beaten half to death by a man who wanted this land and didn't get it. I've had a county sheriff put at my door by a man who wants this land and hasn't gotten it. I've been maneuvered, investigated, and watched since the day I arrived in this territory." She picked up the pen from beside the papers. "What I haven't done is sign anything I didn't choose to sign. Let's fix that." She signed. Whitfield looked at the signature and then looked at her with the measured respect of a man who didn't give that particular expression out casually. "I'll be at the county office when it opens," he said. The filing was done by 10 the next morning. By noon, Victor Hale knew about it. Emily was in the garden behind the ranch house she'd taken to growing things a habit from her mother, because there was something about putting your hands in dirt that made abstract fears feel more manageable when she heard hoofbeats on the road. Multiple horses. She stood up and wiped her hands on her apron and walked around to the front of the house. 3 riders, Hale in the center, 2 men flanking him who had the particular posture of men employed specifically to flank. He pulled up at the edge of the yard and looked down at her from his horse, and for the first time since she'd arrived in Cedar Ridge, he wasn't smiling. "You filed a claim," he said. "I filed my claim," she said. "There's a distinction." "You've made a decision without understanding the full picture," he said. "I'd like to talk to you about that." "You can talk to my attorney," she said. "His name is Whitfield. He's staying at the hotel in town. You probably know which room." A muscle in Hale's jaw moved. "Emily." "Miss Harper," she said. The 2 flanking men exchanged a glance. "Miss Harper," Hale said with a controlled patience that was its own kind of warning. "That land is going to change hands one way or another. The railroad is coming. The territory is going to determine claims through a federal process that will take years and cost you more in legal fees than the land is worth if you're fighting it without the right backing. I am offering you that backing. I am offering you a fair price and a partnership that protects your interests. You are offering me exactly what Thomas Garrett offered me," she said. "A transaction dressed up as generosity." Something moved across his face, fast there and gone. "Garrett was a fool and a drunk," he said. "I'm neither." "No," she agreed. "You're something more careful, which makes you something more dangerous. I know that. I'm not confused about what you are, Mr. Hale. What I am is uninterested." She held his gaze. "You should go." He looked at her for a long moment, really looked the way you look at something you've miscalculated. Then he looked at the house behind her, and she knew without turning that Daniel had come out the door. She didn't turn. She kept her eyes on Hale. "This isn't finished," Hale said. "No," she said. "It isn't. But it's not going to finish the way you planned it." He turned his horse and rode out with his 2 men behind him, and she stood in the yard until they were gone, and then she breathed. Daniel came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the solid fact of him. "You should have come and gotten me," he said. Quiet, not angry. "I handled it," she said. "I know you did." A pause. "That's not why I said it." She looked at him sideways. He was watching the road where Hale had gone. His expression the closed, careful one she'd learned to read as concern wearing a practical mask. "He's going to come back with something other than words," Daniel said. "I know," she said. "Emily." He turned and looked at her directly. "I need you to hear me, not as someone telling you what to do, as someone who—" He stopped, something working behind his eyes. "As someone who doesn't want to be standing in a yard someday, wondering what he should have said." The sentence landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. She looked at him, at the careful way he'd constructed that sentence, leaving out the word he'd almost used, the word that would have changed the temperature of everything. "I hear you," she said, quietly. He nodded, looked back at the road. They stood there for another minute side by side, not touching in the particular charged silence of two people who have just said something significant, while appearing to have said almost nothing. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in the back room with the bar lock secured and stared at the ceiling and thought about all of it. The deed, Hale Whitfield's papers, the three riders in the yard, Daniel in the doorway, and then, because her mind had a habit of finding the thing she was trying not to think about, she thought about Anna. She thought about a woman who had lived in this house and laughed in this kitchen and been destroyed by something that should have had consequences and didn't. She thought about what it cost to be destroyed by something that had no consequences, the particular grinding injustice of it. The way it didn't just break you, it broke your faith in the idea that breaking could be answered. She thought about what Daniel had said on the porch weeks ago, that sometimes things that look like accidents are justice wearing a disguise. She thought about Richard Caldwell dead in a ditch, officially an accident. And she thought about Dr. Evelyn Carter. It was a small thing, a nothing thing almost. But she'd met Evelyn Carter twice, once in the Mercantile, once at Sunday service, when Clara had insisted on bringing her. Dr. Carter was the wife of Cedar Ridge's physician, a quiet woman with precise hands and an unusual stillness about her. She had looked at Emily both times with a quality of attention that went slightly beyond ordinary social interest. Like she was seeing something she recognized and was deciding what to do with the recognition. Emily had filed it away. The way she filed everything. Now at 2 a.m, she took it out and looked at it. Evelyn Carter had known Anna Brooks. Clara had mentioned it in passing weeks ago, Anna's closest friend. The person Anna had told first before she told Daniel. The person who had listened and kept the secret and watched the justice system protect the man who had destroyed her friend. Emily stared at the ceiling. She thought, what would I do if it were my closest friend? She thought, what would I do if I knew who had done it and watched him walk free? She thought, what kind of woman has precise hands and unusual stillness and looks at a survivor with the expression of someone who understands exactly what surviving costs? She didn't have an answer. Not yet. But the question had a shape now, and she recognized the shape, and she lay in the dark of the back room and held it very carefully, because some shapes, once you could see them, clearly, could not be unseen. The threat came 3 days later. Not from Hale directly, he was smarter than that now. It came through the deputy Cal Reardon, who rode out to the ranch with the professional neutrality of a man delivering information he didn't personally endorse. Someone filed a challenge to the Harper claim, Reardon said at the kitchen table, hat in hand. This morning, under the name of a company called Territorial Land Partners, LLC. They're claiming the original grant documents were improperly recorded and that the land reverted to territorial jurisdiction 12 years ago. Whitfield, who was still in Cedar Ridge and sitting across from Reardon with the focused expression of a man who had been waiting for exactly this move, said, "On what evidentiary basis?" "They've produced a document," Reardon said. He pulled a folded paper from his coat and set it on the table. "A recording certificate from the Territorial Office dated 1870 that purports to show the Harper claim was formally abandoned by the original filer." Emily looked at the document, Then she looked at Whitfield. Miss Harper's mother filed the original claim in 1869. Whitfield said carefully. He was looking at the document with the intense focus of a man spotting something in text that most people would miss. She was alive in 1870. She did not abandon the claim. He tapped the paper with one finger. This recording certificate has a clerk's seal I've seen before. It appeared on one of the 3 previous filing attempts I traced last week. He looked up. This document is forged. The word dropped into the room like a hammer. Reardon looked at the paper, then at Whitfield. You can prove that. Give me 48 hours and access to the Territorial Recording Office in Prescott, Whitfield said. I can prove it. Reardon leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of a man recalculating something significant. Then he looked at Emily. Miss Harper, he said. I want to tell you something that's going to sound like I'm speaking out of turn for a county deputy. Go ahead, she said. Victor Hale has filed legal challenges in this territory before. 3 that I know of personally. In each case, by the time the challenge was resolved through proper channels, the person he was challenging had either given up and left or had accepted a settlement that was well below fair value. He paused. He's patient, he's well-resourced, and he has a particular talent for making people feel that fighting is more expensive than surrendering. He's telling you to be ready for a long fight, Daniel said from the doorway where he'd been standing. I'm telling her to be ready for a long fight, Reardon confirmed. And I'm also telling her that if that certificate is forged, that's a federal offense. That's a different caliber of trouble for Hale than a civil land dispute. Emily looked at Whitfield. Prescott, she said. 48 hours. Can you go today? I can leave within the hour, Whitfield said. Then go, she said. Battersquare. Whitfield left. Reardon left. And Daniel closed the door behind them and stood in the room with Emily and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not worry, not calculation, but something rawer than both. Something that had come up from underneath all the practicality and quiet steadiness and was standing in his face without his full permission. Emily, he said, and stopped. She waited. When this is over, he said. Slowly, like he was choosing every word with great care and still wasn't sure he was choosing the right ones. When the deed is clear and Hale is dealt with and Whitfield has done what he's going to do. He stopped again. I want to ask you something, but I'm not going to ask it now, because right now, everything you're deciding is tangled up with everything that's threatening you, and I don't want... He pressed his lips together. I don't want you to have to decide anything while you're under siege. She looked at him, at this man who had offered her choices from the first moment, and was still even now trying to make sure that what he wanted didn't compromise what she was free to choose. She thought about the photograph under his bed, the face of a man who hadn't yet learned to brace himself. She thought about the question she'd asked herself that night. What would I do if it were my closest friend? She thought about how long it had been since someone had stood in a room with her and cared more about her freedom than his own desire. Daniel, she said. He looked at her. Ask me, she said. Something moved across his face, a fracture in the careful control of it. Not yet, he said quietly. Not while you're still in the middle of this. She wanted to argue. She didn't. Because she understood him, this man, his particular shape of love, the way it expressed itself as patience and restraint rather than urgency. She understood that for a man who believed he had failed to protect once the greatest act of care was making absolutely sure he wasn't accidentally pressing. All right, she said. Not yet. He nodded. He looked at her one more moment, that full, unguarded look she was starting to recognize as his most honest expression, and then he went back out to the barn. And Emily stood in the kitchen of the ranch in Cedar Ridge, Arizona Territory, with a forged document on her table and a lawyer riding hard toward Prescott, and a dangerous man in town who was no longer hiding his intentions and felt underneath all of it, under the fear and the practicality and the urgency, the clean, surprising weight of something that had been growing in her without her permission. Something she was going to have to name eventually. Something she thought might be the beginning of what she'd been trying to find before any of this started. Not fair treatment, something better than that. Outside, the wind was up again, and somewhere in Cedar Ridge, Victor Hale was planning his next move. And somewhere on the road to Prescott, Whitfield was riding with a forged document in his satchel that was about to become the most important piece of paper in the territory. And in the back of Emily's mind, quiet and persistent as water finding stone, was the memory of Evelyn Carter's eyes, and the question she still hadn't answered, and the feeling cold certain gathering that, before this was over, the truth about Anna Brooks was going to surface from wherever it had been buried, and when it did, it was going to change everything. Whitfield came back from Prescott in 36 hours instead of 48. Emily heard his horse before dawn and was at the door before he reached the porch, and she knew from the way he was riding fast forward, the posture of a man carrying something urgent, that whatever he'd found in Prescott was not small. He came through the door and set his satchel on the table and opened it without sitting down and pulled out a document that was clearly not the one he'd taken with him. This one was older, with the particular yellowed quality of paper that had been properly filed and left alone for years rather than manufactured to look old. The original recording certificate, he said, from the territorial office in Prescott, filed by Margaret Harper, your mother, in 1869. Witnessed and stamped by 2 clerks, both of whom are still alive and one of whom I spoke to yesterday evening. He looked at Emily. The document Hale's company produced is a forgery. The clerk's seal is a copy, a good one, but the registration number sequence is wrong by a single digit. A mistake that would take someone with access to original territorial records to catch. Can you prove it in front of a judge? Daniel asked. I can prove it in front of a federal judge, Whitfield said, which is exactly where this is going. He sat down finally, and she could see the road on him, the dust and the hours, and the particular tight energy of a man who had been moving fast and was now allowing himself to stop. There's something else. He pulled out a second document. This one was a letter official stationery territorial seal at the top. While I was at the recording office, I asked the clerk, the one who remembered your mother's original filing, whether there had been any federal interest in the land claims along the railroad corridor. He told me a U.S. Marshal's office out of Prescott had opened an inquiry into fraudulent land filings in this territory 8 months ago. Whitfield set the letter on the table. They've been building a case. Hale's name is in it. Caldwell's name was in it before he died, and Thomas Garrett's name is in it. The 3 of them looked at the letter. They were all connected, Emily said. Not a question. Garrett was not a local man who happened to find your name in a record search, Whitfield said. He was recruited. Someone in the Marshal's inquiry believes it was Hale, identified your claim, identified you as the heir, identified that you were in Chicago, and unaware of the land's value, and arranged for Garrett to make contact under the guise of a matrimonial advertisement. Emily sat down very slowly. She put her hands flat on the table and looked at them. He didn't find me by accident, she said. No, Whitfield said. Victor Hale sent him. The Marshal's office believes so, yes. She looked up. Her voice, when it came, was very even. So from the moment I read that newspaper advertisement in Chicago, I was already inside someone else's plan. Yes, Whitfield said. I'm sorry. The kitchen was quiet for a long moment. Daniel was watching her with the focused attention of someone who was ready to catch something if it fell. But nothing fell. Emily sat at the table and breathed and let the full shape of it settle into her, the long reach of it, the coldness of it, the way it stretched back past Cedar Ridge and past Thomas Garrett, and past the 3 days of her marriage to a newspaper page in a city 1,000 miles away. Then she said, "When does the U.S. Marshal arrive?" Whitfield blinked. I sent a telegraph from Prescott. He indicated he could be in Cedar Ridge within the week. Good, she said. Then we have a week to make sure that when he gets here the case he's building is as complete as possible. Daniel looked at her. Something in his face, not surprise exactly, but a kind of quiet recognition. Like he was watching her step fully into herself and seeing the shape of who she was, maybe for the first time, without fear obscuring any of it. What are you thinking? He said. I'm thinking, she said carefully, that Hale knows Whitfield went to Prescott. He knows the forgery has been identified. He's going to move quickly now. He's going to try to consolidate whatever he can before a federal officer arrives." She paused. "And I'm thinking that there's a piece of this we still haven't addressed." "Anna," Daniel said. "Anna," she confirmed. "And Evelyn Carter." She went to see Evelyn Carter alone. Daniel didn't argue, which told her he understood why it needed to be that way. Some conversations could only happen between women. Not because men weren't capable of understanding them, but because the thing she needed Evelyn to do, the thing she suspected Evelyn might be ready to do, required the particular safety of a room without witnesses of the wrong kind. Evelyn opened the door and looked at Emily for a long moment without speaking, and then she stepped back and let her in. The doctor's house was neat and quiet. Evelyn Carter was perhaps 45, with silver threading through brown hair and those precise hands Emily had noticed before, and the stillness that was not serenity, but control. The kind of control you develop when you are carrying something very heavy and have decided that setting it down is not an option. She poured tea. She sat across from Emily. She looked at her with the direct gaze of a woman who had decided that the time for indirection was over. "You've been asking about Richard Caldwell," Evelyn said. "Not directly," Emily said. "No, but Clara talks to me. And the way you've been putting things together?" Evelyn stopped, looked at her cup. "I've been waiting for someone to come to this door for 3 years. I thought it would be a marshal. I thought it would be Daniel." She looked up. "I didn't think it would be someone who'd been in this town for 5 weeks. I had reasons to pay close attention to how things connect here," Emily said. "Yes." Evelyn looked at her steadily. "What do you think you know?" "I think Richard Caldwell did not die in an accident," Emily said. "I think someone who loved Anna Brooks and watched the justice system protect the man who destroyed her decided to take a different kind of action. And I think that person has been living with that decision for 3 years, and it has cost them something significant." She paused. "I'm not here to expose you, Evelyn. I'm here because a U.S. Marshal is arriving in Cedar Ridge within the week to investigate Hale and Caldwell and a land fraud scheme. And I need to understand how much of what he finds is going to point in your direction before I decide what to do about it." The room was very quiet. Evelyn Carter looked at her for so long that Emily started to wonder if she'd miscalculated entirely, if she'd walked into this house and accused an innocent woman of something monstrous and was about to face the consequences of that. Then Evelyn set down her teacup and said, "He wasn't going to stop." Emily waited. "Caldwell assaulted Anna in September of 1879, Evelyn said. Her voice had changed lower, more careful, the voice of someone opening a door they'd kept sealed for a long time. "She came to me that night, not to the doctor's office, to this house, to me. She was—" A pause. A breath. "She was destroyed. Not physically, though that was bad enough. But something in her, the way she understood the world, the way she understood that there were rules, and that the rules meant something that broke, permanently. She told Daniel," Emily said, 2 weeks later, "because I told her she had to. That she couldn't carry it alone, and that Daniel deserved to know, and that they could fight it together." Evelyn's hands tightened around her cup. "And then Daniel went to the marshal, and the marshal went to Caldwell, and Caldwell had 3 friends in the right offices and a lawyer from Tucson, and within 2 weeks the whole thing had been quietly buried." Her voice had gone very flat. "No charges, no record, nothing. And Anna didn't survive that," Emily said quietly. "She died in April of 1880, Evelyn said. And I stood at her grave, and I looked at Richard Caldwell standing 20 feet away, wearing his good suit and his civic face, and I made a decision." She lifted her eyes to Emily's. "I don't regret it. I want to be clear about that. I have thought about it every day for 3 years, and I do not regret it." "What did you do?" Emily asked. She needed to hear it said plainly. "I knew his habits," Evelyn said. "He rode out to his north property every Thursday evening, alone. The road there has a particular section where the creek bank is unstable. My husband had mentioned it to him twice about it being dangerous at night. She held Emily's gaze without flinching. I spooked his horse. He fell. The creek bank gave way. He was dead before anyone found him in the morning. The words sat between them like stones. Emily did not look away. Did anyone know? My husband suspected, Evelyn said. He never asked. I think he made the same calculation I did and chose not to put it into words. She paused. Clara knows. She's known for 2 years. She carries it the same way I do. Another pause. And now you know. Emily thought about Daniel on the porch, saying sometimes things that look like accidents are justice wearing a disguise. She thought about whether he knew, whether somewhere beneath the guilt and the grief he had allowed himself to suspect and chosen the same silence as the doctor. The marshal is here for Hale and the land fraud, Emily said carefully. Caldwell is connected to that investigation, but he's dead and officially accidental. Unless someone gives the marshal a reason to look more closely at how he died, there's no reason for that to change. Evelyn looked at her. Are you saying you won't tell him? I'm saying what I know about justice, Emily said. I know what it looks like when it works, and I know what it looks like when it fails. I know what it costs women when the failure is official and the predator walks free. She met Evelyn's eyes directly. Richard Caldwell assaulted your closest friend. The system protected him. Your friend died. You made a choice that the system wouldn't make. She paused. I'm not going to be the mechanism by which a different arm of that same system comes back around to punish you for it. Evelyn was very still. But, Emily said, I need something from you. What? Everything you know about Caldwell's connection to Victor Hale, the land dealings, the county recorder, any document, any conversation, any detail you have, because Anna's story and my story and the story of every person Hale has run off their land in this territory are connected, and the marshal needs to understand how connected they are. Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. Then she stood up and went to a cabinet in the corner of the room and opened it and took out a tin box. She set it on the table and opened it, and inside were letters, folded documents, a small ledger. Anna kept records, Evelyn said quietly. After the assault. When it became clear that the legal route was closed, she started writing down everything she knew about Caldwell, his business dealings, his partners, the names of the men in the county office he had arrangements with. She gave them to me 2 months before she died. Her voice was very steady now, the voice of someone who has been waiting to be useful for a long time. She said, keep these. Someday someone will need them. Emily looked at the tin box. She thought about Anna Brooks, broken and clear-eyed, carefully documenting the mechanisms of her own destruction, not for herself anymore, but for whoever came after her. She thought, I am who came after her. May I take these? Emily said. They were always meant to be taken, Evelyn said, eventually. Sobbed. She brought the tin box to Daniel. She set it on the kitchen table and opened it and explained where it came from, and she watched Daniel's face move through more things in 5 minutes than she'd seen it move through in 5 weeks. The shock of the documents, the recognition of Anna's handwriting, the understanding of what his wife had done in the months before she died, the careful, quiet, devastating act of building a record while she was falling apart. He put his hand flat on one of the letters and left it there like he was steadying himself. She knew, he said. She knew this day would come eventually. She made sure it could, Emily said. He was quiet for a long time. She sat across from him and let the silence be what it needed to be, because she had learned in this kitchen at this table over these weeks that his silence was not absence. It was process. It was a man who had learned to move through large things slowly, because moving through them fast had never worked. Finally, he said, Evelyn. Yes, Emily said. Yes. He looked at the table. I suspected, he said. For about a year afterward. I didn't pursue it. He looked up. Was that wrong? No, she said. Without hesitation. He held her gaze. How are you so certain? Because I know what Caldwell did, she said, and I know what the system did after, And I know what Anna did with the time she had left. She didn't spend it on anger or revenge. She spent it on documentation, on making sure the truth had somewhere to go. Emily paused. Evelyn was the instrument of one kind of justice. Anna was the architect of another. Both of them were trying to do the same thing, make sure it didn't get to happen again. Daniel looked at the tin box, at his wife's handwriting on the folded letters. "She was braver than I knew," he said. "She was exactly as brave as you probably knew," Emily said. "You just didn't have the evidence until now." Something broke open in his face, briefly, completely, and then settled into something new. Not the old grief, not the guilt. Something different. Something that looked like a man finally being given permission to grieve cleanly, without the weight of self-accusation mixed into it. He pressed his hand flat on the letters one more time. Then he straightened up. "Whitfield needs to see all of this tonight," he said. "I know," she said. "And the marshal. Whitfield will know how to present what's useful and what to leave alone," she said. "That's what lawyers are for." He looked at her steadily. "You thought all of this through before you went to Evelyn." "I thought most of it through," she said honestly. "Some of it I figured out while I was sitting in her kitchen." A ghost of something moved at the corner of his mouth. He stopped. "What?" He shook his head slightly. "I'll tell you later," he said, "when there's time to say it properly." She held his gaze for a beat longer than necessary. Then she stood and closed the tin box and carried it to the table where Whitfield was waiting in the front room. The U.S. Marshal arrived on a Wednesday. His name was Samuel Greer, and he was nothing like what Emily had assembled in her imagination. She'd been expecting someone large and authoritative, the embodiment of federal weight. What arrived was a quiet man of 50, with a neat beard, a worn coat, and eyes that had the particular quality of someone who had spent 30 years watching people try to deceive him, and had stopped being surprised by any configuration of it. He sat at the kitchen table. That table had become a kind of courtroom by now, Emily thought, and he spread his own documents next to Whitfield's and Anna's letters, and the forged certificate, and the original from Prescott. And he went through all of it with the methodical thoroughness of a man who understood that what he was looking at was not one crime, but the long shadow of many crimes spread across many years. He asked questions for 2 hours. Most of them were directed at Whitfield, some at Emily, a few at Daniel. At no point did he express surprise or emotion. He wrote in a small notebook with the compressed handwriting of someone who had learned to say a great deal in very little space. At the end, he closed the notebook and looked at Emily directly. "Miss Harper," he said, "you understand that what you've brought me today, the forged certificate, the recording history, the documentation, your late predecessor compiled. This is the foundation of a federal case against Victor Hale for land fraud forgery of territorial documents and conspiracy. Combined with what my office has built over the past 8 months, this is a matter that will result in federal prosecution." "I understand that," she said. "I want to be transparent with you," he said. "This case is going to take time to move through the federal system. Months, possibly longer. During that time, Hale will know he's under federal investigation, and he may become unpredictable." "He's already unpredictable," Emily said. "He's been unpredictable since the day I arrived." Marshal Greer looked at her. "I want to place a deputy in this town," he said. "Formally. With the county's cooperation. I've already spoken to Deputy Reardon, who is more than willing." "That would be welcome," Daniel said. "There's one more thing," Greer said. He looked at his notebook for a moment, then back up. "Thomas Garrett. His death. My office has been looking at it in the context of this investigation. We believe Garrett was killed by someone connected to Hale, specifically someone who feared Garrett's failure with the Harper claim would become a liability. Garrett was not merely unreliable. He was potentially a witness who could be flipped." He paused. "You were never a serious suspect, Miss Harper. I want to be clear about that. The Maricopa inquiry was a formality that Hale attempted to exploit, but my office closed the angle on you within days of Reardon's visit here." Emily let that settle. "Hale killed the man he sent to marry me," she said, "because the man failed." "We believe so," Greer said. "We're building that evidence separately." She looked at the table covered in documents and thought about the long, cold calculation of Victor Hale. The patience of him, the reach of him, the way he sat in his saloon in his good suit and moved people around a territory like pieces on a board. She thought about Thomas Garrett, drunk and violent, used and then discarded. She thought even his instruments were victims in their way. That didn't change what Garrett had done to her, but it added a dimension to the shape of the thing. "What do you need from me now?" she asked. "Stay visible," Greer said. "Stay in Cedar Ridge. Don't give Hale any reason to believe the case is anything other than proceeding normally. And if he makes a move, any move direct or through intermediaries, I want to know about it within the hour." "He'll make a move," Emily said. "He's not the kind of man who accepts that he's lost without trying one more thing." "No," Greer agreed. "He isn't." Hale made his move 4 days later. It didn't come from Hale himself. It came through a man named Pete Sutter, one of the two who'd flanked Hale in the yard, who caught Emily alone on the road between the ranch and town on a Friday afternoon on the stretch where the road bent and the sight lines were short. He pulled his horse across the road in front of her. She stopped the wagon. She looked at him with the steady, unhurried attention she'd developed for exactly this kind of moment. "Mr. Hale wants a conversation," Sutter said. "Mr. Hale knows where to find my attorney," she said. "Not that kind of conversation." Sutter shifted in his saddle. He was not a complicated man. She could read him in about 8 seconds. He was uncomfortable with this particular errand and was doing it anyway, which made him more dangerous than someone who was comfortable with it. Comfortable men were performing. Uncomfortable men were capable of escalation. "What kind of conversation?" she said. "The kind where he makes you an offer he won't make twice," Sutter said. "He says the federal thing is going to drag on for years. He says in the meantime life in Cedar Ridge can be either comfortable or very uncomfortable depending on choices you make in the next few days. He says he's willing to give you fair market value for the claim and let you walk away clean. And if I don't take that offer," Sutter looked at her. He had the grace at least to look like he didn't enjoy the next part. "He says accidents happen in territories," he said. "He says a woman living alone on a ranch 2 miles from town is particularly vulnerable to accidents." Emily looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Mr. Sutter, I want you to think carefully about what you've just said to me. I want you to consider that a U.S. Marshal is currently camped at the hotel in Cedar Ridge, building a federal case against your employer. I want you to consider that what you've just delivered to me is a threat against a witness in that federal case, which is itself a federal crime." She held his gaze. "And then I want you to consider whether the money Victor Hale is paying you is worth what comes next." Sutter stared at her. "I'm going to turn this wagon around," she said calmly, "and ride back to Cedar Ridge and tell Marshal Greer exactly what you said word for word. What you do in the next 5 minutes is going to determine a great deal about your future." She picked up the reins. "I'd think fast if I were you." She turned the wagon and drove back toward town without looking behind her. Her hands were shaking by the time she was out of his sight line, but she didn't stop, and she didn't let the shaking show while it mattered, and she counted that as enough. Greer moved on Hale that same evening. It was not the dramatic confrontation Emily had imagined, if she'd imagined one. It was paperwork, a federal warrant delivered by Greer and Reardon together to the saloon, where Hale received it standing at his own bar in his good suit, with the particular stillness of a man who had known somewhere underneath all his maneuvering that the day was coming. He didn't fight it. He didn't run. He read the warrant and set it on the bar and looked at Greer with the expression of a man making one final calculation. "You know this won't hold," he said. "It'll hold long enough," Greer said. "I have lawyers." "So does Miss Harper," Greer said. "Better ones, as it turns out." Emily wasn't there for it. She heard it from Reardon the next morning, who delivered it with the satisfied, careful neutrality of a deputy who had very much wanted to be the one handing over that warrant for a long time. She was at the ranch when Reardon told her, standing in the kitchen with Daniel, and when Reardon left, she stood very still for a moment and let it be real. Victor Hale was in federal custody. The land was hers. Anna's documents were in the hands of a federal marshal who understood their value. She put her hands on the counter and leaned on them and breathed slowly, because the release of tension that had been held in her body for weeks was a physical thing, heavy and disorienting. Like setting down a weight you'd been carrying so long, you'd stopped noticing it was there. "Emily," Daniel said. She looked at him. He was standing across the kitchen, and he was looking at her with the unguarded expression she'd come to know, the one without the protective layer over it, the one that was just him, just the man underneath all the quiet and the careful distance. "I said I'd ask you something when this was over," he said. She straightened up from the counter. Her heart was doing something she didn't try to manage. "You did say that," she said. He came around the table. He stopped a foot from her and looked at her directly, the way he'd looked at her on that street on the first day, like he was seeing all of it at once, and had made his assessment, and it was permanent. "I'm not a man who has a lot of words for things," he said. "You know that." "I know that," she said, "but I have enough words for this." He looked at her. "Stay. Not because you have nowhere else to go. Not because the ranch needs someone in it. Stay because He stopped. Started again. "Stay because the past 5 weeks have been the first time since Anna that I felt like the future was something I could look at without." He pressed his lips together. Without needing to look away. She held his gaze. She thought about Chicago and a newspaper and the word fair treatment printed in ink she had believed was a promise. She thought about how far she'd traveled to find out what she actually wanted, and how she'd had to survive a great deal to arrive at the clarity of knowing. She thought about the photograph under the bed, the man who hadn't yet learned to brace himself. She thought, "I want to know that man. I think I am beginning to." "Daniel," she said. "Yes, you didn't rescue me," she said. "I want to be clear about that." "I know," he said. "You offered me a choice on a street and I took it," she said. "Everything after that was mine." "I know that too," he said. "Good," she said, "because I'm not staying to be rescued, and I'm not staying out of gratitude." She looked at him steadily. "I'm staying because this ranch and this town and this difficult, complicated man in front of me are the first things in a long time that have felt worth staying for." Something happened in his face that she thought she was going to spend a long time learning to read. Something that was grief and relief and hope all occupying the same space at once, and the particular astonishment of a man who had stopped believing he deserved to feel any of those things. He didn't reach for her. He was not that kind of man, not yet. Not in a kitchen in the late afternoon of a very long few weeks. But he held her gaze with all of himself in it, and she held his. And between them, in the quiet of the ranch, something was named that had been building since a street in Cedar Ridge on an afternoon that felt like a very long time ago. Outside the territory went on being what it was, hard and wide and indifferent to the small human negotiations happening in ranch houses and hotel rooms and county offices. But in that kitchen, two people who had each survived the particular damage of being failed by people who should have protected them stood across from each other and decided quietly, without ceremony, without anything dramatic to mark the moment, to stop running in opposite directions. It was not an ending. It was the first morning of something. The morning after Hale's arrest, Cedar Ridge woke up different. Not quieter, if anything. It was louder the way towns get when something that has been pressing down on them lifts suddenly, and people remember they have voices. The saloon sat locked with a federal notice on the door. The two men who'd flanked Hale on his rides out to the ranch were gone before dawn. Reardon confirmed it with the particular tone of a man who had decided not to spend energy chasing people who were running away from the problem, rather than toward it. Pete Sutter, who had blocked Emily's wagon on the road and delivered a threat against a federal witness, had apparently made the calculation she'd suggested and ridden hard in the opposite direction of Marshall Greer. Emily heard all of this from Clara, who arrived at the ranch by 8 in the morning, with fresh bread and the comprehensive situational awareness of a woman who processed information the way rivers processed rain. Everything eventually came through her. "The county recorder resigned this morning," Clara said, setting the bread on the counter with the satisfaction of someone delivering exactly the news she'd been waiting to deliver. "Submitted his papers to the county office before Greer could formally summon him. Which means he knows what's coming and chose the slightly less humiliating version of it." "Smart man," Emily said. "Cowardly man," Clara corrected. "But in this case, the cowardly choice and the correct choice happen to align, so we'll accept it." She sat down. "How are you?" Emily considered the question honestly. "Tired," she said. "And something else I don't have a word for yet." "Relief that hasn't finished arriving," Clara said. "Maybe that," Emily agreed. Daniel came in from the barn and poured himself coffee and stood at the counter and listened to Clara's account of Cedar Ridge's morning with the attentive quiet of a man who was processing his own version of what the day meant. Emily watched him from across the kitchen, the set of his shoulders, the way the tension he'd been carrying for weeks had shifted into something different. Not gone, but changed in quality. Less like a man bracing against something incoming, and more like a man who was beginning to believe the incoming had passed. Clara looked between the two of them, with the sharp, affectionate perception of a woman who had known Daniel Brooks for 20 years and was seeing something in him she had not seen in 3. She didn't say anything about it. She ate her bread and drank her coffee, and talked about the county recorder, and the federal warrant, and the remarkable speed with which Victor Hale's network of associates was discovering urgent business elsewhere in the territory. And when she left, she squeezed Emily's hand at the door just once firmly and said nothing, which said everything. Whitfield came to the ranch that afternoon with papers for Emily to sign formal documentation of the claim assertion, a letter confirming Whitfield's representation in the federal proceedings, and a preliminary valuation of the Harper land that made Emily sit down when she read the number. "That can't be right," she said. "It's a conservative estimate," Whitfield said. "The railroad's route confirmation is expected within 3 months. Once that's official, the value increases significantly." She looked at the number again. She thought about Thomas Garrett and a newspaper advertisement and the word fair treatment printed in ink on a page in Chicago. She thought about a man who had looked at this number and decided she was a mechanism for obtaining it. "What do I do with land worth this?" she said. Not to Whitfield, not really, to herself or to the room. "Whatever you choose," Whitfield said with the professional simplicity of a man who understood that his job ended at the legal boundary of the question. Daniel was sitting at the table. He'd been quiet since Whitfield arrived, listening. He said without looking up from the surface of the table, "There are 3 families in this territory that Hale and Caldwell ran off their claims. Clara knows who they are." Emily looked at him. "That's what you do with land worth this," he said. He looked up, then met her eyes. Part of it, anyway. She held his gaze. She thought about Anna's documents, the careful, precise records of a woman who had known she was documenting injustice for someone who would come after her. She thought about the widow with 2 boys who'd been driven off her land by a scheme Hale and Caldwell had built together and walked away from without consequence. "Can that be done legally?" she said to Whitfield. "Using proceeds from the land sale to make restitution to families who were defrauded in connected schemes." Whitfield looked at her for a moment with the measured expression of a man who had been practicing law for 30 years and was occasionally still surprised by the directions people chose. "It can be structured," he said. "It's not simple, but it can be done." "Then structure it," she said. Whitfield wrote something in his notebook. "I'll need names and documentation of the original claims." "Clara Fitch has the names," Daniel said. "Anna's documents have the connection to the schemes. Between the 2 of them, you should have what you need." Whitfield looked at the 2 of them across the table and wrote something else in his notebook that Emily suspected was not a legal note. Then he gathered his papers and stood and said he'd return in the morning with revised documents, and he left. The kitchen was quiet. "That was your idea," Emily said. "The families." "It was the obvious thing," Daniel said. "It wasn't obvious. It was generous." He looked at her directly. "Anna would have done it," he said, simply without sentiment. if she'd been the one holding the deed. Emily felt the truth of that land on her like something physical. Anna Brooks, who had spent the last months of her life documenting injustice for a future she knew she wasn't going to be part of. Who had put her records in a tin box and given them to her closest friend and said someday someone will need these. She did do it, Emily said quietly, in her way. Daniel looked at the table. He nodded once, slow. And she could see it in his face, the particular expression of a man who was finally, after 3 years, beginning to grieve cleanly. Not guilt grief. Not the corrosive, self-directed kind. Just loss. Pure and heavy and survivable. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He looked down at it, then up at her. He turned his hand over and held hers, and they stayed like that for a while in the quiet of the kitchen. And it was the simplest thing that had happened in weeks, and the most significant. The federal hearing was set for 6 weeks out in Prescott. In the time between, Cedar Ridge did what small towns do when the structure that has been dominating them is suddenly removed. It reorganized itself. The saloon was purchased by a man named Abbott, who had been running a dry goods operation out of Tucson and had been watching Cedar Ridge's growth with commercial interest. The county recorder's replacement was a methodical woman named Frances Holt, who had previously worked in the Territorial Land Office and had a reputation for making fraudulent filings extraordinarily difficult to execute. Deputy Reardon was quietly promoted to interim sheriff pending the county's formal process, which everyone understood was not actually pending at all. Clara Fitch said at one of the kitchen table gatherings that had become a regular feature of Emily's weeks. Towns don't change their character easily, but sometimes one thread gets pulled and the whole weave shifts. Hale was the thread, Emily said. Hale and everything connected to him, Clara said. Caldwell before him, the recorder. The whole network of men who decided that the rules were for other people. She looked at Emily steadily. You pulled the thread. I had a lot of help, Emily said. You had resources, Clara said. Help is different. Help is what Daniel did, what Whitfield did, what Reardon did. She paused. You were the one who decided not to run. Emily thought about that on the ride back to the ranch that evening. She thought about what it had meant each time she'd chosen to stay in Cedar Ridge in the kitchen after the sheriff's visit in Evelyn Carter's house on the road when Pete Sutter blocked her wagon. Every choice had felt in the moment like the only available option. But that she understood now was what courage was. Not the absence of fear, but the inability to locate a better option than staying. Evelyn Carter came to the ranch 12 days before the federal hearing. She came alone in the early evening, and she knocked at the door with the particular knock of someone who is not certain of their welcome. Emily opened it and stepped back to let her in without ceremony because ceremony between them would have been false. They sat at the table. Daniel made himself scarce in the way he had of understanding when a room needed to contain only certain people. I've been thinking about the hearing, Evelyn said. So have I, Emily said. Whitfield says my name may come up, Evelyn said, in the context of Anna's documents, as the person who held them. It probably will, Emily said. In that context specifically, as a witness to Anna's state of mind and her documentation process. She paused. Not in any other context to my knowledge. Evelyn looked at her hands. And if Greer asks me direct questions, you answer the questions you're asked, Emily said carefully. About what you knew, about Anna, about what she gave you and why. She held Evelyn's gaze. Questions about Richard Caldwell's death will be directed at the official record which says accident. You don't correct the official record unless you're under oath on that specific question, which as far as I can tell you, won't be. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. You've thought about this carefully, she said. I've thought about justice carefully, Emily said. There's a difference between the truth and the whole truth, and the law understands that difference even when it pretends not to. She paused. What Caldwell did to Anna, and what the system did after, and what happened to Caldwell eventually, those are 3 separate events. The federal case is about Hale. That's where the truth that matters is pointed. Evelyn looked at her for a long time. I don't know how to thank you, she said. Don't? Emily said. Anna kept those documents for someone who would use them. I used them. That's the whole transaction. She paused. What I need from you going forward is to keep being the person Anna trusted. Cedar Ridge is going to need women like you for a long time. Evelyn left in the early dark, and Emily stood on the porch and watched her go and felt the weight of what she was carrying on behalf of that friendship, the secret of it, the justice of it, the cost of it, and decided, not for the first time, that she could carry it. That it was the right weight for the right reason. Daniel came out and stood beside her on the porch. She going to be all right, he said. Yes, Emily said. She's been carrying this for 3 years. She's strong enough. Like you, he said. She looked at him sideways. I'm not. You are, he said, not a compliment. Just a fact stated plainly the way he stated most facts. You came off that stagecoach 3 weeks into your healing and started pulling threads without stopping. That's not luck, and it's not circumstance. He looked at her. That's who you are. She held his gaze in the dark. You said you'd tell me something, she said. In the kitchen after Hale was arrested. You said something that you'd tell me later when there was time to say it properly. He was quiet for a moment. The sounds of the ranch settled around them, the horse in the barn, the wind moving somewhere distant, the territory breathing its wide, indifferent breath. I was going to say, he said slowly, that you are the most. He stopped, tried again. That watching you in these weeks has been like watching someone. He stopped again, and she could see him struggling with it. The man who did not have a lot of words for things, trying to find the right ones for the thing that mattered most. Daniel, she said quietly. Let me get it right, he said. She waited, watching you. He said finally, has reminded me what it looks like when someone decides that what happened to them is not the last word on what they are. He looked at her directly. I needed to see that. I needed to see it in someone else before I could believe it was still possible for me. A pause. You did that. Without trying to. Without knowing. He held her gaze. I don't know what to call that except important. Essential. The thing I didn't know I was waiting for. She stood on the porch of the ranch in Cedar Ridge, Arizona territory, and looked at this man, this quiet, careful, damaged, decent man who had offered her a choice on a street when the world was offering her none, and she thought about everything it had taken to stand here. The newspaper ad, the 3 days, the stagecoach, the street, every choice since. Every morning she'd made breakfast, and every evening she'd sat on the porch, and every conversation at the kitchen table that had built piece by careful piece the architecture of something real. I need to tell you something too, she said. He waited. I came to Cedar Ridge with nothing, she said. No plan, no resources, no understanding of what I owned or what was being done to me. I came here broken in a way I wasn't sure was fixable. She looked at him. And I'm standing here tonight with a deed and a lawyer and a federal case in motion and... She stopped. And I know exactly what I want. For maybe the first time in my life, I know exactly what I want, and I'm not afraid of it. What do you want? He said. Quiet, direct. This ranch, she said. This town. The work of making something out of the Harper land that means something. She held his gaze. And you. In whatever form you're able to offer, in whatever time it takes to get there. She paused. I'm not in a hurry, Daniel. I know what happens when people move faster than the truth of things can support. I'm willing to go at the pace of honest. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, I haven't been able to look at the future for 3 years without looking away. I know, she said. I'm looking at it now, he said. Without looking away. She let that be what it was, complete sufficient more than she'd expected from a man who had just said he didn't have a lot of words for things. Good, she said. The federal hearing in Prescott lasted 4 days. Victor Hale's attorneys were expensive and aggressive and ultimately insufficient. The evidence was too comprehensive, the documentation too meticulous, the pattern too clear across too many years. Anna's records provided the connective tissue between Caldwell's old schemes and Hale's current ones. Whitfield presented the forged certificate with the precision of a man who had been waiting his whole career for exactly this kind of case. Emily testified for 2 hours on the second day about Garrett, about the advertisement, about the deed, about Hale's approach on the street and at the ranch, and through Pete Sutter on the road. She testified in the flat, clear voice of a woman who had decided that the truth was the only instrument she needed, and she was going to use it without decoration. The judge, a federal man from Prescott, with 20 years on the bench and no patience for elaborate land schemes, listened to all of it with the focused expression of someone assembling a picture one piece at a time. When the picture was complete, he looked at it and ruled. Victor Hale was convicted on 3 federal counts: land fraud, forgery of territorial documents, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 8 years in the federal penitentiary in Yuma, which was the kind of place that made a man in a good suit reconsider the choices that had brought him there. The county recorder, who had facilitated the filings, compelled to testify by a prosecutorial immunity deal that his lawyer had negotiated frantically in the 48 hours before the hearing, confirmed every detail of the scheme, and named 4 additional associates who would face their own proceedings in subsequent months. Emily stood outside the Prescott courthouse on the 4th afternoon and breathed the air of a town that was not Cedar Ridge, and thought, it's over. Then more accurately, this part is over. Then most accurately, this part is finished, and what comes next is mine to choose. Daniel stood beside her. He'd been beside her for all 4 days in the courthouse, at the hotel, at the meals they'd eaten in silence, or in conversation, depending on what the day had required. He had not testified. There had been no reason to call him. But he'd been present with the steady, solid quality that she had stopped taking for granted, and started actively noticing the particular way his presence changed the temperature of a room from something she was enduring alone to something she was moving through with someone. "Ready to go home," he said. Home. She turned the word over. She thought about Chicago, about a boarding house room with thin walls, about a newspaper folded to the matrimonial section, about a man who had promised fair treatment in ink and delivered something entirely different. She thought about a ranch 2 miles outside Cedar Ridge with a bar lock on the back room door, and a kitchen table that had become a courtroom, and a negotiating table, and a place of confession, and a place of breakfast, and slowly, gradually, incrementally, a place that felt like the center of something she was building, rather than enduring. "Yes," she said. "Ready." They stopped at Clara's on the way through Cedar Ridge. She opened the door before they could knock. She had always done this, and Emily had stopped finding it surprising, and looked at their faces and said, "It's done." "It's done," Emily confirmed. Clara pulled them both inside and put food on the table and poured coffee and sat across from them and said, "Tell me everything," which they did, and the telling took an hour and covered all of it. Hale's face when the verdict was read, the recorder's testimony, Whitfield's handling of the forged certificate, the judge's ruling, and by the end of it, Clara was sitting with her hands wrapped around her cup, looking at Emily with the expression of a woman who had watched something she'd hoped for come true, and was taking a moment to actually feel it. Anna would have... Clara started and then stopped, pressed her lips together. "I know," Emily said. "She would have liked you," Clara said. "She would have..." Another stop. Her eyes were bright. "She spent those last months making sure someone would come along who could use what she left. I think she'd be glad it was you." Emily felt the weight of that settle into her, the strange layered gratitude of being chosen by someone she'd never met for a purpose she hadn't known she was carrying until she was already carrying it. "Tell me she'd have been all right," Emily said. "If things had been different, if the system had worked the way it was supposed to." Clara looked at her. "She'd have been magnificent," she said. "She always was." Emily nodded. She held that for a moment, the grief of a woman she'd never known, the gift of her records, the strange invisible bond of surviving adjacent to each other's damage. Then, she set it in the place where she was learning to keep things that were true and heavy and survivable. She stood up. Daniel stood with her. "Come to dinner Sunday," Emily said to Clara. "Both of you bring the doctor." Clara looked at her, then at Daniel, then back at her. "Both of us," she repeated. "Your family," Emily said, simply. "Both of you. All of you." Clara made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, and was entirely characteristic of her. "Sunday," she said. "I'll bring pie." The last move Victor Hale made came not from Hale himself. He was in a federal holding cell in Prescott by then, but from his attorney, a man named Breckett, who arrived at the ranch 2 weeks after the verdict with the particular energy of someone executing instructions he personally found distasteful. He had a document, a counterclaim filed the day before the verdict, arguing that Hale had a prior oral agreement with Garrett regarding the Harper land that predated Emily's legal claim assertion, and that this agreement constituted a valid interest under territorial common law. Emily read it at the kitchen table with Whitfield beside her. Then she put it down and looked at Breckett. "This was filed the day before the verdict," she said. "Your client knew he was going to lose and filed this as a contingency to tie up the land in civil litigation afterward." Breckett had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I'm executing my client's instructions," he said. "Of course you are," she said. She looked at Whitfield. "How long does this take to dismiss?" 30 days approximately," Whitfield said. "An oral agreement without documentation between a man now convicted of federal fraud and a man who died before establishing any formal interest has essentially no standing. Any territorial judge will dismiss it on summary motion." "File the motion tomorrow," Emily said. "Already drafting it in my head," Whitfield said. She looked at Breckett. She looked at him with the full, clear attention she'd developed for men who arrived with documents designed to frighten her, and she felt consciously, deliberately, nothing that resembled fear. "Mr. Breckett," she said, "your client is in Yuma for 8 years. This claim will be dismissed in 30 days. I want you to go back to wherever you came from and tell Victor Hale if you visit him that it's over, that there is nothing left to pull here, that Emily Harper is not leaving Cedar Ridge." Breckett put his hat on and left. The door closed behind him. Whitfield looked at her with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had enjoyed watching that particular scene. Daniel was standing at the counter. He was looking at her with an expression she had finally fully learned to read, the open one, the one without armor. "He really thought he could still win," Daniel said. "Men like that always do," Emily said. "Right up until they can't." She stood up from the table and walked to the window and looked out at the ranch, the barn, the yard, the road that ran toward Cedar Ridge and past it toward a territory that was still being decided, still being shaped by the choices of the people living inside it. She thought about a stagecoach door swinging open. She thought about dirt and a torn dress and a crowd closing in. She thought about a voice from the edge of that crowd, low, unhurried, offering something unprecedented. In that particular moment, a choice. She thought about every choice since then. Every morning she'd made them, sometimes afraid, sometimes clear, always moving forward. She turned from the window and looked at Daniel. "I want to plant something in the east field," she said. "In the spring." He looked at her. "What kind of something?" "I don't know yet," she said. "Something that takes time to grow. Something you have to be patient with." She held his gaze. "Something worth staying for." He crossed the kitchen. He stopped in front of her and looked at her with the full weight of everything he was, the grief and the guilt, and the healing and the quiet love that had been building in him since a woman had fallen out of a stagecoach and made his coffee and stood her ground in his yard and pulled threads until the whole weave of Cedar Ridge shifted, and he said, "I'll help you plant it." She looked up at him, at this man who had offered her shelter when she needed it, and respect when the world had offered her none, and who had loved her. She understood now, had understood for some time, the only way a man like him could love. Slowly, completely without conditions, and with a patience that came not from indifference, but from knowing exactly how much was at stake, she reached up and put her hand against his face. He closed his eyes for a single moment, the way people do when something finally arrives that they'd stopped letting themselves want. Then he opened them and looked at her. "Emily Harper," he said. Her name in his voice, her real name, the one she'd reclaimed from 3 days of nightmare, was the quietest and most permanent thing she had ever heard. "Daniel Brooks," she said. And that was enough. That was everything. Two people who had each survived the particular wreckage of being failed by a world that should have protected them stood in the kitchen of a ranch in Cedar Ridge, Arizona Territory, in the autumn of 1882, and chose each other not out of desperation, not out of gratitude, not out of the absence of alternatives, but out of the clear-eyed, deliberate, fully awake knowledge of what the other person was, and what they were capable of, and what they were worth. They did not run from what had broken them. They did not pretend it hadn't happened. They carried it, both of them, the way people carry the things that have shaped them, not as wounds anymore, but as weight that had taught them what they were made of. And in the spring they planted something in the east field, and they were patient with it, and it grew.